At least 11,000 think tanks exist globally. They are basically policy and research institutions providing advice and information which shape governmental decisions and equally those in the private sector. Well, this can fully be good, especially in an economic environment marked by morosity, anxiety, and constant mutations. It is the case with the Trade Law Center based in Johannesburg, South Africa, one of the leading think tanks on the continent when it comes to economic matters within the context of the application of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I am Charles Ebune here at the Onomo Hotel in Douala, the economic capital of Cameroon, and my guest today to discuss the progress of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area is the Executive Director of the South African-based Law Trade Center. Trudi Hartzenberg, welcome to Global Watch.
Thank you so much, Charles. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning.
You are on a continental tour which started from your own country, South Africa. You have been possibly in Kenya and you are in Cameroon and possibly you are traveling to Rwanda. What is the purpose of the continental inspection mission?
Charles, we are working on the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfTA. This, as you know, is an important initiative to boost intra-Africa trade, but also to change how and what Africa trades with the rest of the world. Very important that we take a look at the opportunities of the African Continental Free Trade Area for all countries. Cameroon has a number of competitive advantages to be able to trade, for example, in agricultural products. The coffee, tea, white pepper, and other products that are produced here are excellent quality. Similarly, of course, other countries also have products which they can trade. So the aim of the AfCFTA is to boost intra-Africa trade, which remains very low. 15% of Africa's exports currently are destined for other African countries. We need to boost that. But in order to do that, we also need to boost our productive capacity. And that also means looking at trade facilitation. Cameroon, of course, has a big advantage to be a transport and logistics hub. If we look at the port of Douala, it can connect a number of inland countries, some of which are landlocked. So services
the
such as...
Central African Republic, Chad.
Exactly. So Cameroon is also a transit country to the inland region in Central and parts of West Africa, and that offers significant opportunities. So my mission is to start off with 4 countries, you've mentioned them, South Africa, Rwanda, Kenya, and of course Cameroon, and to see how we can assist particularly small, medium, and micro enterprises and women and youth enterprises, which are often small and don't necessarily know about all the opportunities and what the requirements are in order to trade under the preferences of the AfCFTA.
The Trade Law Center based in South Africa was born in 2001, so plus 2 decades on, you are championing intra-African trade. Why are you interested in such a commitment?
Charles, for us all on the continent, this is particularly important. If we look at Africa's trade relationship with the rest of the world, we export raw materials, mining products, the critical minerals, and agricultural products. We don't add value on the continent. So in order for African countries to develop, we need to build cross-border value chains, we need to attract investment. This will improve the quality of life for all. But it is important to keep in mind that a free trade agreement such as AfTA does not automatically bring benefits. There's a great deal of work we need to do in our countries to reduce the red tape, the regulations that are not harmonized, and so on, so that we can boost economic activity and also have cross-border linkages. So if, for example, we have a producer in Cameroon that would like to process agricultural products, but it needs some inputs from a neighboring country, and the goods are stuck at a border post, that's not conducive to cross-border value chain development and industrialization. All of the countries on the continent, including my own South Africa, wants to industrialize and develop and diversify its economic structures for the benefit of the citizens.
Your center, apart from championing the inter-African trade agenda, and one of the ways you do that is possibly by providing policy advice and specifically to policy training. For roughly 20 years now, as a research-based think tank, how many people have you trained in policy law implementation, for example?
Charles, thousands. We are very privileged, for example, to have trained a number of policymakers from Cameroon. So we count among our alumni some officials within key agencies in Cameroon. We have some of our alumni at the AFCFTA Secretariat, the African Union Commission, the regional secretariats. And this means that over the 20 years that we have been functioning, we have seen that the capacity to make good policy, to negotiate good trade agreements and to implement them has definitely improved. In particular, I'm not a lawyer, but some of my colleagues are. We have seen significant strides in trade law capacity. But we have to keep in mind that a trade law or a trade agreement is not an end in itself. It is there to achieve the development policy objectives of our countries. So lawyers and economists must work together in the policy-making value chain, from making good domestic policies, negotiating effective agreements with their partners, and very importantly, implementing them effectively.
And one of the towering trade law policies and agreement, which of course is of paramount concern, and you mentioned it that some of your trainees are championing its implementation, is the African Continental Free Trade Area, expected to significantly lift plus 30 million Africans out of poverty within a decade by 2030. Where are we with the implementation of African Continental Free Trade Area, agreed roughly 8 years ago by 44 African countries?
Charles, we are still in the early stages. We have to keep in mind that we are negotiating an agreement among unequal partners. There are some small island developing states, some landlocked countries, least developed countries, but then also, of course, more developed countries, Morocco, Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa. So to find the necessary compromises in the negotiations is very difficult. But we have made good progress. And we keep in mind that a country like Cameroon is one of the first pioneers in the pilot, which we refer to as the Guided Trade Initiative, which began in October 2022. That will now come to an end, and we will implement the full AFCFTA. Then we can all start trading all the products that we are producing. So when the AFCFTA is fully operational, we know that all bilateral trade will take place under preferences, either AFCFTA or the existing regional economic communities like ECAS, ECOWAS, EAC and SADC. So all bilateral trade will then be on preferential terms.
You just spoke about the handwork of the regional economic communities, ECOWAS, ECAS, COMESA, SADC, and whatsoever. As a research-based think tank and somebody who is on the field, how do you evaluate the success of the pilot phase, which involved between 7 and 8 countries for the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, whose secretariat is, of course, based in Accra, Ghana?
Charles, the small number of countries that have been participating have shown us where some of the challenges are. in terms of cross-border trade. The long delays when you apply for a certificate of origin, for example, understanding what standard certificates may be needed and will they be accepted by the importing country. So, for example, the Revenue Authority in Cameroon may issue a certificate, but the test is really when the product comes to the importing country's border, will that be accepted? So this operational phase now of the Guided Trade Initiative has been to test to see how these processes will work. So we have learned a lot of lessons. A big issue that has come to the fore is in fact that many businesses don't know if their products are eligible for AFCFTA preferences. And the products that they want to trade are not yet on that list of eligible products. So this kind of information, dissemination and sensitization, awareness creation among the business community is so important. We are reminded that governments negotiate the trade agreements, but it's the private sector that trades. And in most of our countries, most businesses are small, medium, and micro enterprises. For them, access to information is in fact a non-tariff barrier, and we have to eliminate those. So the more training, the more information we have that is accessible, particularly to small businesses, the better the AFCFTA will work eventually.
Of the continent's roughly 1.5 billion people today, nearly 500 million of them are workers, and the African Continental Free Trade Area excludes the customs regime in the taxation regime in the current framework. When you look at Article 4 and 5 of the African Continental Free Trade Area, can you confidently and authoritatively say that trade is going on across the borders today?
You know, we have to keep in mind, Charles, that although trade has been ongoing for many hundreds of years amongst us on the continent, when we take a look at trade under trade agreements, this is still quite limited because there are barriers. There are various technical requirements that small traders may not meet. But very important to keep in mind that the AFCFTA is also focusing on Africa's industrialization agenda, because we recognize that if we just continue to trade the products we are currently producing, then the impact may not be so great. Okay. So we have to build our capacity. So the AFCFTA has identified a number of priority value chains, agribusiness, and for most African countries, this is a sector of interest. We have capacity across the continent in different agricultural subsectors, and adding value to the agricultural products is not necessarily a technology-intensive exercise, so it's accessible. We can upgrade that value chain. The automotive sector, many countries are now producing automotive components, some are assembling vehicles, and so an automotive value chain is being developed. Transport and logistics is another priority, because we recognize that the cost of transport and transit adds enormously to the cost of delivering a product to the final consumer.
Especially air transport on the continent.
Extremely expensive, and we're not well connected yet. So the number of flights between various destinations for people as well as cargo is still limited. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So the complementary initiatives that will help to boost...
So that the maritime way, the terrestrial transport and the air transport easily mingle goods and services for an increased trade flow.
Absolutely. You know, we have to look at maritime. So, for example, if Cameroonian exporters are sending coffee to South Africa, the obvious route would be maritime transport. Okay. But the reality is that close to 85% of intra-Africa trade is still by road. It's the most costly, most inefficient, but also where the non-tariff barriers are most prolific. There can be roadblocks, police checks on the way. They take time, but they also add costs to intra-Africa trade.
But by training, by theory, by practice, and by experience, you are quite embedded in the development of the continent, and you are equally part of the emerging countries initiatives. You worked with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the African Development Bank, and other bilateral and multilateral institutions. You have a huge package on that. Help me unpack one thing. The African Continental Free Trade Area has been described as the most revolutionary economic agenda and initiative on the continent. Why so?
This is the first time, Charles, that we are looking at integration at the continental level. So far, and we have a long history of integration at sub-regional level. Within Central Africa, we have ECAS, CEMAC, the Monetary Union, we have ECOWAS, we have AMU, the Sunset Sahel region, we've got COMESA, SADC, EAC, and we go all the way down to Southern Africa. But this is the first time that integration moves to the continental level. And this is so important because across the continent, there are still enormous tariff and, in particular, non-tariff barriers. There is some data which I can share with you, which takes a look at the non-tariff barriers and what the equivalent duty or the import tax would be if we had to tarify those non-tariff barriers. And on average for the continent, for agricultural goods, the non-tariff barriers would be the equivalent to a duty of 350%. Can you imagine? For manufactured goods, it's slightly lower, but close to 300%. This is data from the United Nations ESCAP, and the database we monitor very closely. But this gives us an idea of how important the non-tariff barriers are. And non-tariff barriers are not only trade barriers, but they are trade barriers that are so important in terms of cross-border business linkages. Many of our countries are very small markets. So if we want to be efficient, competitive producers, we need access to larger markets. And that's the market integration, the trade liberalization agenda. But equally, we have to keep in mind, of course, that the regional economic communities have much broader agendas. Many of them cooperate on water courses, on education, on tourism, and many, many other areas, peace and security. You know, war is not good for trade integration.
Okay.
So very important agendas.
In the moment the interview comes to an end, you are in Cameroon, therefore, to assist, like you said, in the Trade Law Center alumni activities and to inspect how the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area is going on within the scope of the think tank you are leading. What insights do you have of Cameroon's maneuvering in this pilot phase?
What we have seen so far, and this is through conversations with business associations, but also implementing agencies and the Ministry of Trade, of course, too, is that Cameroon is very excited about the opportunities of the AFCFTA, opening up much larger trade opportunities so that exporting to countries beyond ECAS and CEMAC.
Do you think the country has a comparative advantage of reaping the benefits of this commitment?
I think it has enormous potential. The agricultural sector of Cameroon, I think, has enormous potential. But in transport and logistics, Cameroon could, with the 4 ports that it has, I know 2 are very busy functionally. These could be the services
Douala
hub.
and the Kribi Port Authority.
Exactly. So this, we often think about trade as trade in goods. But
so possibly you may be pushing
services,
for Limbe to go operational.
Absolutely. I think the transport and logistics hub opportunities for Cameroon are enormous. And more we will see maritime transport being used as these opportunities open up. But as you've mentioned, Charles, the interlinkages between the different modes of transport are really important, from maritime to road and hopefully also to rail, because of course in some parts of the continent train transport is not very well developed yet, but the rail networks and the rolling stock investments are increasing there.
We are in a very unique context. You see what is going on in the US with the Trump administration in rechanging the global dynamics of trading patterns. When you look at that and you inject it in the African continental free trade area, a window of opportunity?
You know, Charles, we've got to look at the disruption in trade governance, and of course what we see from Washington almost on a daily basis. And of course on the 1st of April, President Trump will receive reports about reciprocal trades and trade imbalances and so on. If duties are increasing in markets like the United States, and we also see other countries increasing duties in response, in retaliation to what the US is doing, it makes the intra-Africa trade promotion even more important. And I think developing the industrial capacity on the continent, developing agriculture as an industry, because at the end of the day, it is actually a process of taking inputs and producing value-added outputs. There is enormous opportunity for us to supply countries where the US is now imposing duties. So we may well see over time our patterns of trade changing.
Okay.
Important to keep in mind, of course, also the critical minerals we have on the continent, which many, many countries are now seeking. And there we have a lot of opportunities, but also homework to do in terms of how we market, how we mine, how we extract, but also, very importantly, how we add value on the continent.
The continent has a very young population, roughly 450 million of them. And the future of the AfCFTA basically lies on them. What policy advice will you give for the fullest implementation of the AfCFTA to benefit the people?
Charles, you're absolutely right. The youth dividend of the continent can be an extremely important asset. In many parts of the world, there's an aging population and birth rates are falling. So the African continent is actually driving birth rates and population for the next generation and beyond. This is extremely important. It creates a market for the future, but it also creates opportunities for skills development, which may well find its way to other parts of the continent. As far as the AfCFTA is concerned, there is a special interest in women and youth coming through the protocol on women and youth and trade. And then there's the digital protocol. And Africa stands at the forefront of a digital revolution. Young people on the continent are keen to innovate. The creative industries on the continent are very much linked to the digital economy. Production processes are being digitized. Across the continent, we see clusters of excellence as digital hubs developed. But also, small industries are growing. The drone industry growing on the continent is making enormous strides. And this is where our young people are going to be in the future. So they will be innovating in terms of new approaches to production processes, to trade, cross-border digital trade, streaming, and so on. So there are enormous opportunities for our young population.
Is that the purpose of the Pan-African Settlement digital platform, which kept roughly 5 billion of wastage in currency exchange, which was happening?
Absolutely. The Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, perhaps not fully operational yet, but the aim is that we can do cross-border payments and settlement almost instantaneously in domestic currencies, lowering those transaction costs that you are referring to. It has enormous potential, particularly for SMMEs. What we need to do, though, Charles, is to incorporate mobile money into that platform, because there are still many traders, for example, that are not with commercial banks. They're not included in the formal financial system.
Especially for for the roughly 44 million small and medium-sized enterprises which are on the continent.
Exactly.
And with that, we conclude the interview. The Executive Director of the Trade Law Center based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you very much indeed for being my guest here in Douala, Cameroon.
Thank you so much, Charles. It's been a great pleasure.
You're welcome.
Thank you.